Wherever in the world Mint meets, I always feel like I'm coming home. There's something I recognize in all of you and in what we have in common, even though we don't know each other necessarily as people. There's a sense in which we're one, a sense in which we're alike, we're together. So I have a deep sense of belonging when I come to Mint. Um, it does feel like homecoming to me, like coming home, to come to meetings of Mint. And I don't know if you have this experience, but sometimes when I'm teaching MI to people, they say that this doesn't feel like something strange or unusual or new. It feels like something I kind of already knew in some way. It feels familiar to me. Uh, you're helping me understand what I do and why I do it, but it's not like this is a brand new thing that I'm learning. It's something familiar. It's something. In fact, I feel like I belong with it. Yes, this is the way that I want to be with the people that I serve. So in a way, it's something that I've known all along. A strange thing when I went to Norway, I already knew this. And as we began doing demonstrations, my colleagues there asked me to show, well, what does it look like? How do you actually work with people? I was already doing it, but I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't realize that I wasn't conscious of what I was doing, of looking for their own motivations for change, for example. And yet somehow I already knew how to do it. And how did I learn that? That's still a puzzle to me. You know, and I have some other questions. Why is it that people from so many different professions are attracted to motivational interviewing? Say, yeah, this is the way I want to serve people. And it's like they recognize it. Mm-hmm. And why is it that maybe people tell you this too? People in this room have told me this. Learning and practicing MI has changed me as a person. What's that about? If I were still doing research, I'd be trying to understand that. But I do hear it often. And why is it that this seems to cross cultures and languages and nations so easily? That people in Indonesia and Africa and mainland China recognize it and say, yeah, no, yes, I kind of understand this, and I also want to learn it. It's how I want to be with people. What's going on there? It's like pieces of a puzzle that have been coming together for me for 50 years, and they're still coming together. Still don't see the whole picture. Last month, I gave a lecture in San Francisco honoring the memory of my friend and colleague from Scotland, Nick Heather. And Nick was fascinated with brief interventions through most of his career. And so the puzzle that I posed in the talk that I gave there was, what is it that is effective about brief interventions? Why does this work at all? It's something that arose early in my career, as you'll see. It's part of the prehistory of motivational interviewing. And what's going on that in a relatively brief conversation, people can turn a corner on something that's been troubling them for years or decades. What's going on? So that's part of the puzzle for me too. It started for me at the University of Oregon, as you may know. Oregon was an Uber behavioral training program. So when you graduated from the University of Oregon, you were going to be a behavior therapist. And this was back in the era when you chose your school of psychotherapy, and you went to a program that told you what's cool about your school of psychotherapy and what's wrong with all the others, you know? So we're kind of indoctrinated. I never was a behaviorist actually, but I certainly learned behavior therapy while I was there. But before we were ever allowed to lay hands on behavior therapy, before we could begin seeing clients, there was a year-long course in how to talk to clients. And it was required by the behavioral faculty. They said, before people come into our practicum and begin working on this, our students need to know something about relationships. You know? And so they went across campus and hired a faculty member from the counseling psychology program named Susan Gilmore um, to train us. And we spent a wonderful 2 semesters with her. Susan was a student of Leona Tyler, who, as you may know, was a student of Carl Rogers. And so we had the benefit of being trained by an academic grandchild of Carl Rogers. And essentially what she taught us was a person-centered way of being with clients. And it's how I always have practiced behavior therapy ever since. It just fit together for me. So, oh, that's how you do it. My first mentor there was Hal Arkowitz. Hal was very interested in social psychology, began editing the journal Integrative Psychotherapy. He had a very broad view of psychotherapy. And as some of you know, Hal then eventually became a member of Mint and began writing about motivational interviewing in treating people with a whole variety of psychological problems. So Hal kind of came around from being my mentor to being my colleague. And I also want to say I went back to the University of Oregon to talk about brief interventions. And among the people in the audience was another one of my mentors, Lou Goldberg, who was kind of a curmudgeon, and allowed us how maybe the active ingredient, why brief interventions work, maybe the active ingredient is brevity of contact with psychotherapy. I don't know why I attracted bald mentors to me, but I'm joining their ranks also. Yeah. Well, all I had was a year of training with Sue Gilmore in how to talk to clients and how to listen to clients and how to do accurate empathy and affirmation and genuineness and so forth. That's all I had when I went on a summer internship to Milwaukee, to the Veterans Hospital there. And the director of training there said, well, look, you're just here for the summer. So why don't you go around the hospital and visit the wards and units and you kind of see what you'd like to learn this summer. What a wonderful invitation also. And so I did that, and a number of the units I had already had some experience with, neuropsychology and community practice and so forth. But there was an alcoholism treatment unit, an inpatient alcoholism treatment unit. And the director, I didn't know how unusual this was at the time. The director was a psychologist named Bob Hall. And Bob said, oh, well, what do you know about alcoholism? I said, nothing. No family history? Well, no, not really, not that I know of. Well, what do you remember from graduate classes about alcoholism? And I said, well, honestly, I don't remember it ever coming up. And Bob said, well, this is either the first or second most common diagnosis you'll see in your life as a psychologist. You might want to learn something about it. See, Bob knew something about motivational interviewing too, or this way of being with people. So I spent the summer there. And all I knew how to do was listen. So I sat with patients and listened to them, and they taught me about alcoholism. And it was, I learned a lot from it. In fact, I wound up with that being a major area in my career. but the patients also seem to enjoy it. They seem to benefit from someone really listening to them. Um, well, that's interesting. And then I began reading the literature on alcoholism, which said alcoholics are pathological liars. They're in denial. They're incapable of seeing reality. They're very, very difficult people to work with. I said, those don't feel like the people I was talking to. Maybe they're different in Milwaukee. I don't know. But it posed another puzzle for me of why is it that professional opinion about people with alcohol use disorders cast them as being in denial and difficult and oppositional and always fighting against you and denying and so forth. Eventually, I realized it's because of the way we were treating people at the time, in a very confrontational way, because alcoholism treatment in the 70s was quite authoritarian. Sit down and shut up. You don't know anything. I'm going to tell you what's wrong with you and what you have to do. And guess what? Human beings don't warm up to that approach. So I decided, and the people on the inpatient unit, their lives had been destroyed. I mean, they were severe, and I decided I'd kind of like to go upstream a bit and see if we can find a way of helping people not fall into the river before they get to the waterfall. And so my dissertation was around helping people to learn how to drink moderately, which at the time actually was kind of heresy, but I didn't know that. And from my dissertation, I compared 3 different behavior therapies for people with alcohol use disorders: an aversion therapy, a kind of behavioral practice therapy that was very detailed, and a self-control training of just kind of talking to people about strategies you can use to change your own behavior. They all worked. There were no differences at 3, 6, or 12 months. And I was about to give everybody a self-help book at the end of treatment, because at least people in the aversion therapy condition, we hadn't really done much for them in terms of learning how to manage their drinking. And I was just finishing up this book that we called How to Control Your Drinking. It was published in '76. So I was going to give that to everybody at the end of treatment as a help, or maybe an apology in some cases. And then my dissertation advisor, Ed Lichtenstein, said, well, no, wait a minute. This could affect your follow-up data. I don't want this to mess up your follow-up data. But, oh, well, how about if we do a randomized trial here and we just randomly assign people to get or not get the book at 3 months, and then we'll give it to everybody else at 6 months. I said, okay, fair enough. And so that's what we did. When people were finishing treatment at 3 months, we flipped a coin again, and some of them got the self-help book and some of them didn't get the self-help book. We wanted to make sure it didn't mess up follow-up data. Well, it did. It turns out that people who got the book continued to decrease their drinking over time. And by the time we got to 6 months, there was a P001 difference between the groups in how much they were drinking. I said, wow, didn't expect that. Which suggested another possible study, which is, well, then how much better do people do working with a therapist than if you just give them the book and send them home, And, we were nice to people in the one session they got, and we listened to them, and we had done a pretty thorough intake evaluation with them too. But then we gave them the book and said, follow the instructions and we'll see you in 3 months. And I was concerned people would be disappointed because they knew they were being randomly assigned to either seeing a therapist in 1 of 3 conditions or to going home with a book. But often people said, you mean I can do this on my own? Oh, that's great. I don't have to come in. I felt a little bad about that, but. And so we randomly assigned people to get 10 sessions of various kinds of behavior therapy, or to be given a copy of this self-help book and go home, and we'd see them at the end of the follow-up period. We did have them keep self-monitoring cards and mail them in, so a little bit of contact like that, but that was it. What we found was no differences in outcome. Now that's not supposed to be. supposed to be the more time you spend with me as a therapist, the better you get, you know? And yet people going home with a self-help book and working on their own, following the same methods that we were using in outpatient therapy, did just as well. And there were no differences all the way up to 12-month follow-up in the outcomes of people in these two conditions. Well, that was embarrassing. Yeah. So I did what many people have done over the years, which is I fled to New Mexico. It's where people go when they're not getting along with their neighbors, or something embarrassing happened and you just want to get away from it all and go into the desert, you know. So I did. And I assembled a staff back then. We went down to Old Town, had our photo taken down there. And there were two supervisors working with me or sitting on either side of me in this picture, and nine therapists. Well, in the first study that we did, we randomly assigned problem drinkers. So we're kind of saying it must have been something wrong with what I did in Oregon, because that can't be. So we randomly assigned people to one session and go home with a self-help book, or 10 sessions of behavior therapy following the same methods, or kind of souped up behavior therapy. We're also talking about other issues that might be related to drinking, or a group version of behavior therapy. Let's try individual and group and just kind of see how this will go. Same thing. No differences at all over time in how people are doing. Everybody's drinking decreased significantly, big enough change to be health relevant, certainly. And yet, by the time you get out to 15 months follow-up, the groups are the same. Well, let's try a bigger dose of therapy. See, I hadn't discovered about denial yet. Let's try 18 sessions of behavior therapy and compare it with 6 sessions, compare it with sending people home with a self-help book. And this, we randomly assign people to treatment, so that difference is an accident, but a huge, very significant difference. That is, the people in the self-help group were like way worse off to begin with, and yet follow up, everybody's clustered nicely with their drinking moderated. But the outcomes, even though they weren't different between the treatment groups, were different by therapists. And because of my training in person-centered approaches as well as behavior therapy, we were using a rating scale by Truex and Kharkov for accurate empathy, developed by Rogers Group. To what extent are these therapists listening well, understanding, and reflecting back to their clients what they're hearing? And it turns out on that variable, therapists were very different from each other. And we lined them up. Many of you have seen this graph before. We lined them up from 1 to 9. Number 1 was the most empathic therapist. All of us rated her as number 1. And at the other end, number 9, 2 of us rated that person as 9 out of 9. The other is 8 out of 9. And we said, how many of their clients are doing well? And this is the relationship. You don't even need a correlation coefficient to look at this and know there's some kind of relationship there. So on the left is the most empathic therapist. On the right is the least empathic therapist doing the same manual guided behavior therapy. It's a big effect. And remember, we had a self-help group. Their success rate was 60%. If you average all the therapists together, it's 61%, which could lead you to say therapists are no different from self-help books, which on average is true, but look at the graph. We've got 5 therapists whose clients are faring better than if they were just working on their own. Therapist number 7 achieved the same success rate as a self-help book. And then we had 3 therapists who it looked like they might have been better off going home with a good book. And Terry Moyers and I have replicated this, that low empathy actually yields outcomes worse than no treatment. Yeah. Yeah. Well, with those findings, I fled again and went to Norway on, on my first sabbatical leave. And you know the origin story, most of you, about motivational interviewing. I was hired to lecture there about behavioral treatment of alcoholism, which I was doing. But the director of the hospital said, would you also be willing to meet with our therapists? Because they'd like to learn from you and just kind of chat about cases they're seeing and so forth. I said, sure, I can do that. And so every other week or so, I began talking to this group of Norwegian therapists, most of whom were relatively recently trained psychologists, a social worker, a chaplain, you know, kind of variety of people. Most of them pretty new, pretty green out of school recently. And I was teaching them both a person-centered way of being, so I was teaching them accurate empathy, and also behavioral strategies for helping people change. And they said, well, it's, you know, it's fine for you to talk to us about it, but we want to see it. We want to actually see how you do it. How does it look? Well, how would we do that? I said, well, at least one of them, Tom Bart, who's a member of Mint, was very good in English. And he was able to role play in English clients they were seeing that they were finding difficult, and just show us how you would respond to this. As you might guess, the unspoken subtext of this was, okay, smart guy, what are you going to do with this? You know, which is what happens if in training you ask for someone from your trainees to volunteer to be a client. It's the client from hell, you know. It's the client who never responds to anything that you do, you know. There are no clients as difficult as those played by therapists, I can tell you. So I began doing just what was natural for me to do. And these psychologists are very reflective, they're kind of philosophically trained in Norway. And they would stop me. They would interrupt me in the middle of a role play. My American students almost never did that, but we'd be a minute or two into the role play and they'd say, now, wait a minute now. What are you thinking? What are you thinking right now? Or you just asked a question, fair enough. Well, why that question? Why not some other question? You're teaching us reflective listening, okay? And you just reflected something that the client said. But how do you know what to reflect? Why did you reflect that? Why did you reflect that and not many other things the client said? And they caused me to verbalize some decision rules that I seemed to be using, of which I was not aware. And so we kind of started writing these down. And one of the things seemed to be that, well, it shouldn't be me who's making the arguments for change. It should be the client. So I was behaving in a way to arrange the conversation so the client would be telling me why they would want to change and how they might go about it and why it would be important and so forth. And I was interested in the client as a person and in their own motivations for change and what matters to them. And was listening with accurate empathy. The primary thing I was doing was listening well. And when I met what we then called resistance, never pushed against it, never argued with it, never disagreed with it, never said you're wrong, don't you see reality here, or anything like that. But I would listen to that too, would reflect that as well. Because if you push against it, it strengthens the arguments against change. I was being very careful to nurture hope and optimism, because if you persuade somebody that there's a serious problem, but they think there's nothing they can do about it, you haven't done them any favors. So also to see self-efficacy, to see hope, to see possibility for change as well. And gave this the name motivational interviewing because it's about motivation, about the client's motivation. And interviewing, intentionally chosen word, not motivational therapy, you know, motivational interviewing. And interviewing in English, not necessarily when you translate it to the equivalent word in another language, but in English, you don't know who has more power in that discussion. It might be the interviewer. If you're an employer deciding who to hire, you're the person in the power seat. But I also had the experience as an undergraduate of interviewing famous visitors to campus. And I'm definitely not in the power seat in that case. This is a very knowledgeable person, and I'm just trying to learn from them. And it's the same role. And interviewing rather than motivational conversation, because in a conversation, the two people have the same role, whereas an interviewer has a different role. So you've got a different job than the person you're talking to. And I was thinking of that as a preparation for treatment. Wasn't thinking of it as psychotherapy itself at the time, which is why the first two editions of motivational interviewing have the subtitle, Preparing People for Change. Well, I sent that paper around to colleagues to say, what do you think about it? And one of them, Ray Hodgson in Wales, said, I want to publish it. I said, Ray, I just made it up. The only numbers are the page numbers. I mean, I have no evidence that this works. This is just kind of what we discovered together. And Ray said, no, I think it's a brilliant paper. Please let me publish it. So I did. And it became the first published description of motivational interviewing a year after I was in Norway. And he did what editors do, which he sent it to anonymous reviewers to comment and say things. And the person he sent it to was this South African bushman whom I had never met. And I wouldn't learn until 20 years later, actually, that Steve had been a reviewer of that paper. You know? Well, we were doing the international conferences on treatment of addictive behaviors at the time. And the third one, Nick Heather and I worked together to plan it in Edinburgh. And two significant themes in it were motivational interviewing, which was just kind of being developed, and the trans-theoretical stages of change, or the model of change, which is meant much more than the stages. And so Jim Prochaska and Carly DiClemente were also there. So here were two different things in their nascent stages, just getting developed. And they seemed to fit together pretty well. You know, it made a lot of sense together. If nothing else, motivational interviewing is something you can do with people at the pre-contemplation or contemplation or preparation stage, because in my behavior therapy training, I knew how to help people at the action stage. But if they weren't there yet, which was most of my clients, now what do I do? You know, what we did in the addiction field in the 70s, we'll say, go away, drink some more, come back when you're ready, you know? What a bad idea that was. So there was kind of the beginning of our thinking together, and Carla was already a friend, and we stayed in touch over the years and enriched each other's thinking. Well, then I went back to New Mexico and thought, well, how could we turn this into a treatment that we can actually test? Well, let's better start gathering some data, because now I published a paper on it. You know? And so I come up with the idea of a drinker's checkup. We wanted to get people at very early stages of problem development, which is something I came out of that 2-year or summer internship with, wanted to catch people early. So we wanted low thresholds to get people in. What we did was advertise in the newspaper that we have a free checkup available for anybody who's drinking, who wonders whether they might be drinking too much or wonders whether it might harm them. And Scott Walters has done lots of wonderful things with this, including computerizing it. And so we did an assessment that was designed to pick up early effects of drinking in people's lives. And then we had one session of giving them feedback about what we had found. And we gave them a list of treatment referrals in Albuquerque. Well, almost nobody went to treatment. We thought this would motivate people to go to treatment. Nope, it didn't do that. They had the nerve to change their drinking on their own. Again, and their drinking decreased substantially, significantly. I mean, enough to make a real difference in health, and that eventually became motivational enhancement therapy for reasons I'll tell you in just a moment. We even compared a couple different counseling styles. Suppose you give the feedback in a Rogerian empathic style, or suppose you give it in more of a confrontational style, which is what was being done in addiction treatment at the time. And the difference is in what you say when the client says, oh, that can't be right. I don't drink that much. Do you say, well, look, we added it up together and here are the data. These actually, you told us this and here are the norms. And remember you said how much you're drinking and so forth. Or do you say, this doesn't sound right to you. It surprises you. Empathic response. And the same therapist did both styles. And I can tell you, some of them were much better at one than the other. All right. So it was kind of a mixture of stuff happening. But both groups showed some decline in their drinking. We had a waiting list control group, and they very politely waited for us. And then when we treated them when they had the checkup, then they decreased their drinking. That's a finding from my waiting list control studies, that if you tell people they're on a waiting list, they don't change. Even though you gave them a big intake and they talked about all the problems and they presented themselves for treatment, it's just an absolutely flat curve. And then it hit me, they were just doing what we told them to do, which is wait. Clients are very nice to us. Didn't want us to feel bad that they would change before we could treat them. All right. And it began to notice some things. People in these two conditions were behaving differently. So this is what we would now call change talk. And in the kind of directive or more confrontational feedback condition, we've got about half the level of people talking about why they ought to change and would want to change and how they would do it. And a lot less people giving what we at the time called resistance, we now might call sustained talk and discord. And when you look at the ratio between change talk and sustained talk, which we now know does predict behavior change, it is way different. And in the more directive confrontational condition, we left people perfectly ambivalent. Equal amounts of sustained talk and change talk. That's interesting. And in fact, we found that a single counselor behavior, we were measuring what our counselors were actually doing, a single counselor behavior predicted significantly how much clients would be drinking. The more the therapist confronted, the more the client drank. Well, there are now 40 at least controlled trials showing that a brief intervention, a session or two, makes a significant difference in drinking. You can do something in a conversation, and afterwards people substantially change their drinking. Seems like that shouldn't be, and yet over and over and over again it's found. And so with Tom Bean and Scott Tonningham, we tried to figure out, well, what are people actually doing? And I hope Goldberg isn't right, that it's brevity that is the active ingredient. So we read the articles and also called up and talked to the authors of the articles saying, what do you actually do? And that's where we came up with this acronym FRAMES. I love acronyms, as you can tell. And usually there was some kind of feedback being given to people, personal feedback about their own alcohol use. Nevertheless, the theme was always there that it's up to you. And you're the person who can make the change or not make the change. And nothing else is going to do that for you. Nevertheless, there was usually some advice to change. I hope you do. and a menu of options. Lots of different ways you can make a change in your drinking. That was an empowering message. Whenever the counseling style was described, it was empathic, so it was listening well to the person. And there was encouragement for hope, that for self-efficacy, that you can do it. So that's what these things seem to be. That's what seems to be included in these brief interventions. Was it just an artifact of time, or maybe the self-monitoring? Clients said, the thing that really worked was keeping those records. Because when I wrote down every drink before I had it, I really got to thinking, do I really want this drink? I thought maybe that's what it was. So we did a study with 2 control groups, one of whom was on a waiting list. The second was on a waiting list and kept self-monitoring records. Then a group that we saw and did behavioral self-control training, and then a group that got the book and went home. And the group that saw the therapist, nice decrease in their drinking over time. The group that worked on their own, nice decrease in their drinking again, no significant differences. And the waiting list again waited for us. I now think waiting lists are pernicious because you're telling people don't change. Nothing you can do. Sorry, nothing you can do until we can treat you. So it wasn't just the passage of time. It wasn't all the intake assessment we did. It wasn't keeping the records either. Actually, people who kept the record cards, they even drifted up a little bit in their drinking. It was something else. Something else. Well, then Nick invited me for my second sabbatical leave to go to Australia. And I spent that year, Kathy and I went to Sydney, Australia, and I spent that year working at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Center in Sydney. And in the office next to me was this fellow named Steve Rolnick, who was there actually doing a study kind of related to motivational interviewing. And he said, Miller, did you write a paper about motivational interviewing? Not confessing that he had reviewed it, And I said, yeah, did you read it? I'm grateful that you read it. He said, not only did I read it, I'm trying to teach this. And it's become a popular way of working with people with addictions in the UK. And I'm going up and down the UK trying to teach this. And I don't even know if I'm doing it right. You need to write more. I said, well, show me what you do. And we began having fun together with real plays and role plays and so on. And Steve got it. I mean, he understood at a deep level what I was trying to say in that article. And so I said, well, why don't we write a book together? And 2 years later was the first edition of Motivational Interview. Focused on, all this happenstance, Well, Project Match was also happening at the time. In fact, I had to fly back from Sydney to the US for meetings of the Project Match research group. And there are parts of those meetings I don't even remember. It was the jet lag is devastating. But we were designing Project Match at the time. It was designed to figure out who does well in which kind of treatment. And we knew we had statistical power to be able to compare 3 different treatments. And the Institute didn't tell us what treatments. So we had to decide together, well, what 3 treatments for alcohol problems are we going to compare? Almost everybody at the table was a cognitive behavior therapist. And so that was going to be one of the treatments. And it was. Well, what else is there in the world besides behavior therapy? I don't know. Well, there's this 12-step stuff that's going on out there. It seems to be pretty popular in the US. Maybe we could design a treatment to help people understand and get engaged in the 12-step program and fellowship. And I mean, not just tell them about it, but actually begin working the steps and doing it. And so we developed a 12-session, 12-step facilitation therapy, ran it by Hazelden to make sure we were doing okay. One thing Hazelden said was, well, you're a little short on empathy, but other than that, it looks pretty good. And then what's the third treatment? We wanted things that were conceptually very different from each other, just as different as could be. you know, different kind of assumptions and so forth. I said, well, tell us about this motivational interviewing stuff you're doing. And so I did. And we had reasonable data at that point. And they said, well, how long does motivational interviewing take? And I said, well, a session or two. He said, what? No, I mean, we're testing this against 12 session therapies. I mean, it wouldn't be fair to just have a session or two. Can you kind of stretch it a little bit? So we added assessment feedback, which is what we've been testing with the drinker's checkup, and a couple of follow-up sessions, and made a 4-session motivational enhancement therapy. And that's where motivational enhancement therapy came from. So clients, 1,726 clients. This is the biggest randomized trial done in the alcohol field. 1,726 clients randomly assigned to these 3 treatments. And ostensibly, we weren't interested in differences between the treatments, although secretly we were. And what we found was all 3 worked, and worked very well. This is percent days abstinent, a big leap in the first week of treatment, and it just stays there for a year, actually for 3 years. Even had a 10-year follow-up with one of our sites. People make this change and it just stays there on average over time. Now, it's not the same people all the time who are abstaining or drinking moderately, but on average, that's it. I've stayed in the addiction field 50 years because the outcomes are so good. I mean, if you could do that with diabetes, if you could do that with hypertension, have a brief intervention where, 80, 90% of the days there are no problems, and the severity of other problems goes way down, you would be delighted. Well, yeah, the UK wasn't quite happy with that, and so they said, let's do Project Match again, and let's do the treatment better. Let's do a social behavioral network therapy and include the family and lots of bells and whistles. And so they compared motivational enhancement therapy with 8 sessions of this souped up therapy, and same thing. No overall difference in outcomes over time. Will it work for marijuana? Yeah. Multi-site trial, again, at 4 months, adding CBT to MET helped some. It was a significant difference. By 9 months, it's gone. By 15 months, actually, the direction is opposite, that the MET group is looking better than the MET plus CBT group. And in the alcohol field, at least, I'm going to say intensity and length and amount of treatment just doesn't seem to make a difference. You've seen that in the studies I've shown you, but inpatient versus outpatient treatment, the outcomes are about the same. Brief versus extended treatment, outcomes are about the same. It's kind of not what I expected coming out of graduate school. But brief intervention is consistently better than nothing. How about different types of psychotherapy? After all, I was trained in behavior therapy, which is better than its competing models. Well, actually, when you compare different psychotherapies with each other, all of them done by people who are trained in that method and believe in that method, the outcomes are the same. That's very consistently over time. But there are differences within any treatment according to who did the treatment, according to the therapist. Even if they're all using the same structured manual, clients' outcomes are very different depending on who the therapist was. This is Bruce Wampold's major point in his prolific career, that it doesn't seem to be the techniques that are being used that account for outcomes. It's something about therapy. An example is the combined multi-site trial, which we were involved in, 1,300 and some patients. And we had having finished Project Match, we said, let's put those 3 treatments together. So let's do cognitive behavior therapy and encourage people to try 12 steps and be empathic and do motivational interviewing. And so everybody in the psychotherapy conditions got that. And we picked out therapists who treated at least 10 clients using that combined behavioral intervention because we wanted a good sample of outcomes. If the therapist just had 2 or 3 cases, not really fair to talk about their average outcomes. But 10 cases, all right, that's fair. We had 22 therapists delivering the combined behavioral intervention with at least 10 clients. And here's the outcome. Each line is one therapist, all of their clients, percent days abstinent. Of course, they're all over the map. But if you look at the right-hand side of the diagram here, you can see that a year later, there's some therapists, almost all of whose clients are abstinent almost all of the time. And there are also some therapists, almost all of whose clients are drinking almost all of the time, having received allegedly the same treatment and everything in between. It's very consistent within theories of psychotherapy, within structured behavioral intervention manuals, whatever it is, clients' outcomes vary with the therapist who treated them. That's what Terry Moyers and I got interested in. So interested, we spent 2 years reading 70 years of psychotherapy research, looking for studies that measured something about therapists and measured outcomes of each therapist's clients. And there's a lot out there. And we came up with this list of 8 characteristics, which are not personality characteristics. These are skills. All of them are measurable skills. You can actually watch sessions, you can code it, you can see the extent to which these things are happening, and it's related to client outcomes. So, interesting book, yeah. I looked at that list and said, they look familiar. Accurate empathy, which was #1 in our book because it has the biggest overall effect, about a 0.6 average effect on treatment outcomes across problem areas, across theories of psychotherapy, whatever. If you have to hire therapists on one thing that's likely to benefit clients, hire empathic therapists. And don't mean people who feel empathy, that's okay. I mean people who can show you the behavior of accurate empathy, who can listen well and reflect back to clients. Well, that's been part of MI from the beginning. Positive regard, another one of Carl Rogers' big 3. Affirmation has always been part of motivational interviewing. Acceptance of people as they are. Rogers believed that when you feel unacceptable, when you feel ashamed, it's almost impossible to change. And when you experience acceptance as you are, paradoxically, it becomes possible to change. Well, acceptance has been part of the spirit of MI from the beginning. Focus, having clear goals shared between you and the client, that's related to better outcomes in psychotherapy. Focusing is a key task in motivational interviewing. Hope, yes, clients' hope predicts outcomes, but so does therapists' hope. Optimistic therapists have better outcomes than pessimistic therapists do. Evocation, term that Terry and I used to describe you're doing something during treatment so that something happens in sessions that is related to better outcomes. In client-centered therapy, it's called experiencing. Eugene Gendlin's work. Experiencing is a client talking about themselves first person, present tense, with feeling content, not in the abstract, not talking about the past, but here's what I'm experiencing right now. In client-centered therapy, when that happens during sessions, the outcomes are better. In motivational interviewing, change talk during sessions predicts better outcomes over time. So that's what evocation is. Giving information and advice had the smallest effect, and yet it's part of motivational interviewing. Steve and I made the mistake early of describing advice as the opposite of motivational interviewing. It's not the opposite of motivational interviewing. It's how you do it. The way in which you give information and advice makes a difference. And then genuineness. That was something that Steve and I hadn't talked about, but we should have. It should have been there from the beginning. And so it's there in the fourth edition. So now I'm thinking, what does that mean? That what we've been teaching and practicing is essentially these components of helpfulness, these non-specific except they're specifiable, you know, these common except they're not all that common, attributes of therapists. Bruce Wampold calls them therapeutic factors. I think that's a good term. And somehow we have put together all of these therapeutic factors in motivational interviewing. So I'm not sure what that means. And do these cluster together? I got curious about that. Because if you're more empathic, chances are you're more affirming also. If you listen well, chances are you're conveying acceptance also. So these are not independent variables, they kind of go together. And there are ancient concepts that contain many of these same ingredients. 3,000-year-old one in Judaism is chesed. Chesed, when the Bible was being translated for the first time into English, Miles Coverdale, the translator, was trying, what word do I use for chesed? I mean, it's a complicated concept. It has a lot of moving parts to it. There isn't any single word in English that captures this. And so he made up a word. He put together loving, the intention, and kindness, the behavior, and created the word loving kindness, which is a pretty good description of what chesed is all about in Judaism. In Christianity, a very related concept, agape, is a particular selfless kind of loving. The Pali term metta in Buddhism, which is not a theistic religion, you know, often is translated as benevolence, but again, it's one of these complicated ideas with a lot of moving parts. And in Islam, rahmah gets translated compassion, but it also is a really complex idea with a lot of pieces to it. And in the theistic religions, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, these are attributes attributed to God, and also how we are supposed to be with each other. Interesting. Therapists have come up with complex ideas like this too. Toward the end of his life, Carl Rogers was interested in the idea of presence, of being present with your clients, of being there, you know. He said that in a way that kind of captures empathy and genuineness and positive regard. And, you know, it's sort of a combination factor. Or there's research now on responsiveness, on attending to your client and replying to and responding to what they're doing in the moment. You're not following a script and delivering a 12-session scripted behavior therapy. You're really responding to the person in real time. So maybe they cluster together too. Is that what we've been studying all along in motivational interviewing? We really didn't mean motivational interviewing to be done instead of anything else. Over time, it's become clearer that motivational interviewing can be a way of doing what else you do, you know? A way of being with people. When I discovered Carl Rogers' last book, it's called A Way of Being. I said, yes, yes, that's what we're writing about. That's what we're doing. And MI can be combined with other kinds of interventions. And that's how it's being used. If you look at the literature now, complex interventions are MI plus, you know, plus yeah, medications, or, you know, plus cognitive behavior therapy, or whatever it is. You know? So in a way, that's how it's been from the beginning, you know? A clinical style. Here's an early study, one of those brief intervention studies from which we came up with the FRAMES acronym, done by Maury Chaffetz, the first director of the Alcohol Institute. And he worked in the emergency room at Mass General. And people come in injured related to their alcohol use. And typically nothing's done about the alcohol. You patch them up, you send them out the door. And he said, I wonder if we could do something while they're in the emergency room that could make a difference. And see if we could get them to come back and get some treatment for their alcohol problems. And so he compared random assignment, a single intervention in the emergency room after the person's been patched up. They're still intoxicated in most cases. They're hurting, they got bandages on them or whatever, like the worst conditions for psychotherapy you can imagine, But let's try it. And on average, it was about 20 minutes of conversation in the ER with just emergency room treatment as usual. In the first study he did, published in 1961, 42% came back for treatment compared to 1%. And he replicated it the next year, 56% came back for treatment compared to nobody ever came back for treatment with emergency room treatment as usual. And what were they doing? They were listening. They were listening to people specifically in the style of Carl Rogers, in this accurate, empathic kind of way. All right. Well, lots of data. Fasten your seatbelts. I'm going beyond the data. Carl Rogers at 78 in his last book, and I'm 78 now, said, our experiences in therapy and in groups, from that, it's clear that the transcendent is involved, the indescribable, the spiritual. I'm compelled to believe that I, like many others, have underestimated the importance of this mystical spiritual dimension. And Rogers was very careful to stay away from religion and spirituality. He had a fundamentalist upbringing that wounded him, but toward the end of his life, he's saying, I think there's something there, and I'm becoming much more of a mystic myself. I did study quantum changes long ago. These are brief, intense, highly memorable experiences that people have that change them permanently. It's like a one-way door. They can't go back through it. They're better people. Their lives are better. Like Ebenezer Scrooge. And just something happened. It's hard to talk about. It's hard to explain. It's difficult putting it into words. And yet when I described this kind of experience in the Albuquerque newspaper, the phone rang and rang and rang, and people came and wanted to talk to us. Acceptance, that's who we are. That's us at our deepest level. That's how we're meant to be with each other. And they also often, as mystics do, had an experience of union, of connectedness with all people, or all of nature, or all of the universe. It's not just about me, that I'm a part of something much bigger. It's striking how consistent that was. Carl Rogers' way of being, empathy, unconditional positive regard. You don't have to prove you deserve respect. Genuine as being your true self. We have a word for that. It's called love. Mm-hmm. But love can mean a lot of things. C.S. Lewis wrote this wonderful little book called The Four Loves. And he drew on Greek words, ancient words for love, that mean different things. Eros is passionate, romantic, sexual love. Okay? That's one thing we mean by love. Philia is the affection you feel for your family, for your dear friends, for the people you're really close to, you have a bond with. Storge is kind of sentimental attachment. I love chocolate. I love this valley. Those three meanings are attached to love. They're all things you're not supposed to be doing with your clients. And then there's agape. Agape is selfless, asking nothing in return, expecting nothing in return, being empathic, being present, extending unconditional positive regard, being yourself. That's chesed also in Hebrew. Well, what do we know that happens between people that is primarily concerned with the well-being of the other person? That what you care about in the moment is how the other person is and how they're doing. And even a small dose of it can make a difference. I think it's the transforming power of that selfless kind of loving, particular kind of love. And I wrote an article called Rediscovering Fire, got published in 2000. After a lot of effort, I never had more trouble getting an article published. It went through 4 rounds of critique and review, and this is wrong, you got to fix that. I don't get this doesn't make sense to me. I stuck with it, and it finally got published in an APA journal. And what I was saying, I was puzzling about brief interventions. How come we can do something brief that has a transforming effect on people? What's going on? And I suggest there is this ancient concept, agape, chesed, that maybe what's going on, and reviewers had a hard time with it, but I finally got it published. It was a guiding principle for Martin Luther King, agape. And he said, agape is being willing to serve and give without expecting anything in return. Being willing to suffer without wanting retaliation. Being willing to reconcile without wanting the upper hand, without wanting to dominate. Wow. I've written about telos, another Greek concept. That which we're meant to be. The telos of an acorn is the oak tree. Knots and gnarls and twists and imperfections and all. It's what the acorn is meant to become. Rogers wrote about actualization, becoming what you're meant to be. And the human potential movement was related to that. Well, what is the telos of human nature? What are we supposed to be? There are very different theories about it. Psychoanalytic view is inside we are dark, self-serving, selfish motives. And it's captured well in The Lord of the Flies, the novel where children left alone on an island deteriorate to the lowest level of human nature. Or there's behaviorism, which says there is no inherent nature. It's just whatever. Watson said I could take any child and turn him into whatever I wanted to with experience. And then there's theory C, which is human nature is fundamentally positive. That at our core, people are meant to be good and loving, trustworthy, compassionate, pro-social, interested in the welfare of others, what we call humane. That's our nature. Can't prove any of those. But it does matter which one you believe. What did Rogers have to say about human nature? That I have discovered is an interesting word. I have discovered that people have characteristics which seem inherent in their species. Positive, forward-moving, constructive, realistic, trustworthy. He's clearly a theory C person. A human being appears to be an awesomely complex creature who can go terribly awry, but whose deepest tendencies can be trusted to move in this constructive dimension. It's what Rogers came out of his career believing. I don't know if you know the work of Father Greg Boyle. He founded something called Homeboy Industries. He works with people who are coming out of gangs, who have been gang members. And there are only 2 principles, he says, to Homeboy Industries. We are all inherently good, no exceptions. We belong to each other, no exceptions. That's what our quantum changers we're experiencing too. So I got interested in this old concept of loving kindness. How do you do it? What does it look like? We aspire to it. We feel drawn to it. But what do you actually do to embody loving kindness? So I went back and looked at chesed and agape and came up with all of these components. No wonder it's a complicated idea because it's got all these elements to it. And so I wrote this little book, Loving Kindness, describing these 12 attributes of this ancient construct and what it looks like and what the opposite of it is also. And I hope it's a helpful book to people who are interested in becoming more loving kindness. I think that is our telos. Like Rogers, I believe that's who we are at our nature, even though it can go terribly awry. And if that's true, when you witness loving kindness, it would feel familiar. You would admire it. You know? Another of my mentors, another bald mentor, Richard Rohr, in my favorite book of his, Falling Upward, says, life is a matter of becoming fully and consciously who we already are, but it's a self we mostly don't know. It's buried inside us somewhere. But he has that same positive view of what is our inherent nature, that it's loving kindness. It's a particular way of being more concerned for, or at least as concerned for other people as for yourself, being very other conscious, being compassionate and empathic and mindful, being an attentive companion with people rather than telling them what to do, respecting and collaborating with other people's wisdom, honoring their autonomy and their self-direction, offering your own expertise, but with experience, never with permission, never imposing it on people, and fostering hope, which is a complicated idea. That sound familiar? Teilhard de Chardin, a French scientist, philosopher, another wonderful, prolific writer, a priest, also a paleontologist who went on digs and was interested in evolution, wrote about spirituality, religion, and evolution too. And his writings were banned by his church. 1957, the Catholic Church said, you cannot teach this. These are not acceptable books to be used. But he believed in telos, and not just for an individual. He believed that in evolution, we are moving in a positive direction. There's a beacon out there that evolution is moving toward, and it's very good. And in his book, Toward the Future, he concluded with these words that I used in my Rediscovering Fire article. The day will come when, after harnessing space and the wind's gravitation, we will harness for God the energies of love. And on that day, for the second time in the history of the world, we will have discovered fire. We are heading into and are already in a very dark time in our nation. And how can we be? It's a question Elie Wiesel asked. How can we live in a world with that kind of evil there? And he found us an answer to it. It is to live in a way opposite to what you're seeing. And my simple way of putting it is keep showing up in love. Keep showing up in love in your life, in your work. And so with that, I say namaste. The loving kindness in me sees, recognizes, honors the loving kindness in you.